I fell in love with Ryan Carter when I was 16 years old. When he entered a room, he was the type of boy that stopped people in their tracks. Parents love him. He's the star of our high school soccer team. He's quick-witted, and he's charming enough that teachers let him get away with late homework. He wasn't just Ryan Carter, the golden boy, though, in my opinion. He was the one who noticed me, the true me, behind my reserved, scholarly facade. We would spend hours after school sitting on the bleachers or at the neighborhood cafe, chatting about our futures and making wild claims that only teens could believe. Until we found something better, we planned to leave our little village, rent a modest apartment in a busy city, and make ends meet on minimum salary, perhaps even launch a company together. I had faith in him, even though it was foolish and naive. He was my entire universe for 2 years. Then everything was different. Summer turned to October as graduation caps struck the ground, and all of a sudden Ryan was drifting away from the shore like the tide. Once instantaneous, texts now took hours to send. Days. Half-hearted apologies replaced the plans to hang together. And things were different when we finally met. He stopped inquiring about me. Every discussion centered on him, his goals, his college applications, and his prospects. Ryan paused his stroll next to me on a cool October afternoon beneath Riverview Park's wide oak trees. His shoulders were rigid, his hands jammed deep into his jacket pockets. He said, "We need to talk." My stomach turned over. I made an unsteady laugh. That's never a good way to start. Without glancing at me, he kicked at a rock and said, "Look, our relationship, it doesn't fit anymore." The ground seemed to have been pulled out from under me. "What?" I muttered. "I've got enormous plans. I have to think about the future. My career, college." He let out a harsh sigh. "This is preventing me from moving forward. Keeping him back." I looked at him, wondering how the boy I had been in love with for 2 years, the one who had kissed my forehead and said we would make it through the world together, could be saying this. I croaked. "We said we'd figure it out. You mentioned that we'd." He finally turned to face me and interrupted, saying, "I know what I said." However, his hazel eyes were icy and far away, unidentifiable. "I've decided on something. This is the superior option. For us both." For whom is it better? Because I was definitely not okay. As he turned and left, his blue jacket getting smaller with each step, I stood there. He didn't turn around. Not once. I could hardly feel the wind pulling at my scarf as it grew stronger. I felt a hollow pain in my chest that grew till it engulfed me. The life we had planned together was suddenly over. The worst part, though? I didn't realize that was only the start of my horror. The test that made all the difference. I had a late menstruation 2 weeks later. I initially told myself it was stress. It all made sense: the breakup, the pressure of my senior year, and my parents' constant nagging about college. Then, however, the sickness began, the kind that made my stomach turn over when I smelled my mom's coffee in the morning. With my hood up like a thief, I paid cash for the test at a pharmacy across town. I shut myself in the bathroom at home and waited with my heart pounding. Then 2 lines of pink. Staring back at me was a harsh, indisputable reality. No, 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 no. Breathing heavily, I held on to the sink. This was not taking place. It shouldn't be taking place. I was 17 years old. I had no savings, no work, and no idea how to raise a child. What about Ryan? He had already left. My spiral was broken by my mother's speech. "Supper is ready. It's getting cold. Come on." The plastic bit into my palm as I stuffed the test into the pocket of my sweatshirt. As I entered the dining room, my legs felt like lead. It was a typical Tuesday evening in a typical home, with 2 parents who still thought their daughter was typical, and the air was heavy with the aroma of meatloaf and gravy. I wasn't. My voice was no more than a whisper as I lingered beside my chair. "I need to talk to you, Mom and Dad." As he looked at me through his glasses, my dad folded his newspaper. "What is this about?" My mother stopped in the middle of scooping mashed potatoes. "You look like you saw a ghost, sweetie." I clenched my chest. My hands were shaking. "I am expecting a child." There was a complete, oppressive hush in the room. Gravy spattered across the tablecloth when the serving spoon fell out of my mother's grasp and clattered to the floor. The color of my dad's cheeks changed from pink to flaming crimson. His fists crushed the newspaper. "Are you expecting?" My mother screamed. My dad snarled and pushed his chair back so forcefully that it shrieked, saying, "You disgrace us." "How could you have been so incredibly foolish?" I winced. My eyes were burning from tears, but I refused to back down. My voice cracked as I added, "I didn't plan this. However, I'm not escaping it." "Are you not running?" My father gave a sour chuckle. "You don't realize what you've done. You're 17 years old. A child rearing a child. Who is the father to? That child from Owen?" I bit my lip. "Ryan has left, so he gets away with it while we have to clean up your mess?" "It's not a mess," I yelled. "This is my kid!" The words seemed too enormous for me to say and too fantastical to be true. However, they were. My mother sobbed while covering her lips with her hands. "What are people going to say? The church, the neighbors, who gives a damn what people think?" I yelled. My dad's face was red with rage as he pointed a trembling finger at me. "Want to act like an adult? All right. But you're not going to do that in my house. Leave." It was a slap of words. My knees gave way. My vision became hazy. "You're dismissing me?" I spoke in a tiny voice. Feeble. "Just like that?" He tightened his jaw. "Freya, you created your bed. Now lie in it." My father's remarks were like a painful litany that kept ringing in my head as I staggered up to my room. With trembling fingers, I grabbed my duffel bag from beneath the bed and filled it with whatever I could find. A couple of sweaters, my go-to pair of jeans. The small journal in which I had recorded my dreams now seemed like a joke. I took the framed picture of Ryan and me at the county fair, our happy faces captured in a moment, blissfully oblivious to the future. I nearly smashed it against the wall for a second. Rather, I stuffed it into my bag side pocket, just a friendly reminder of the price of love. My mother wept into her napkin downstairs. My father was gone, most likely locked in the garage. My voice was raw as I stood in the doorway. "I'm going." My mother's eyes were swollen and red when her head jerked up. "Wait, Freya. What are you going to do?" With the truth finally sinking into my bones, I hesitated. I had nowhere to go, no house, no strategy, nobody. Aside from one individual, grandmother Elena. The wind howled behind me as I went out into the chilly January night. As I strolled down our neighborhood with my duffel bag weighing heavily on my shoulder, the wind sliced through my sweater. The walkways were covered in snow, and the streetlights created lonesome, lengthy shadows. I had no idea where I was heading. I simply knew I had to leave. Ryan had left. I had been kicked out by my parents, and I had nothing except $50 in my pocket and a duffel full of regrets when I was 17 years old, pregnant, and standing in the chilly night. Squeezing my phone with icy fingers, I navigated to the last remaining name, Grandmother Elena. Over the previous few years, I hadn't seen her very often. She had always called my dad stubborn, and he had always dubbed her a meddler. My dad never liked her, saying she was too soft, too forgiving, and too much of a bleeding heart. However, I recalled every call. "You ever need anything, Freya, you call me, you hear? You always got a place here." After taking a deep breath, I hit the call button. Once, the phone rang. Twice. Then there was a click. "Freya? That's you?" Her voice was warm but gritty, like gravel beneath a tire. "Known." The words stuck, even though I opened my mouth. It wasn't until my breath caught that I realized I was crying. My entire body trembled as I gulped out, "Grandma. May I stay with you? Can I come right now?" A pause. Then there was a rustling sound, possibly her shifting in her old recliner. "What's going on, honey?" "Your voice is shaky," I muttered. "When I get there, I'll explain." "Grandma, please." She responded right away. "You can, of course. I'll put on the kettle while you get yourself safely here." The line died. After a moment of standing there with my breath escaping in trembling clouds, I gripped my bag more tightly and began to move in the direction of the bus stop. I didn't turn around. The 2-hour bus travel to Springfield seemed to go on forever. Hunched over, I gripped my duffel as if it were the only thing holding me to the outside world. Flashes of my parents yelling, Ryan's vacant stare, and the 2 pink lines on that fucking test filled my head. I wasn't planning. I had no idea how I would handle this. But Grandma Elena was with me. It was something. At a station that was almost deserted, the bus finally moaned to a stop. The sight of Grandma's small brick home a few blocks away felt like a tiny pocket of comfort in the icy night, even though the air was colder and sharper here. Before I could even knock, the front porch door had already flung open. There she was, Grandmother Elena. Her silver hair was twisted back in an untidy ponytail, and she was wearing an old quilted robe. Her piercing gray eyes quickly scanned my face. She made no inquiries, didn't exert pressure. She simply spread her arms wide, and I fell into them for the first time in weeks. The place smelled of old books and cinnamon. It was tiny and disorganized, as only homes with love could be. Shelves stacked with broken teacups, crooked picture frames, and the faint sound of a radio playing jazz late at night. She pushed me in the direction of the couch. "Take a seat. Get warm. I'll prepare a delicious meal for us." As my body finally caught up to the fatigue, I collapsed against the plaid cushions. She returned with a plate of leftover meatloaf sandwiches and 2 steaming mugs a few minutes later. "Eat," she urged plaintively. It wasn't until I bit into the warm bread and felt it soak into my freezing bones that I understood how hungry I was. We ate in silence for a time. Only the crackling of the old radiator, the hum of the radio, and the clink of forks. However, the pressure of everything was too great, and I lost my resolve. I clattered my mug down and murmured, "Grandma, I made a mistake." She didn't recoil, didn't turn away. I waited and took another long sip of tea. I was expelled by my parents. I was a disgrace, they said, that I damaged everything. I had to force the words out of my throat. "And I'm expecting." She sighed deeply, and her eyes grew softer. "The kind of struggles that I probably didn't even realize existed for years," she whispered. "Oh, child," as she reached across the table and gave my hand a firm, loving touch. When people are angry or afraid, they say a variety of things. I've heard worse, for heaven's sake. But pay attention to me. She gave my hand a squeeze. "A child is not ashamed. Never." I took a deep breath. That's not how they see it. They're blind then. The words were forceful yet blunt. I blew out a trembling breath and used my sleeve to wipe my nose. "Ryan isn't even aware. Furthermore, I'm not sure how I'm supposed to handle this on my own," Grandma sneered. "By yourself? You got me, don't you, girl?" My eyes were burning with tears. I gave a nod. Her eyes glowed fiercely as she leaned back. "All well then. We'll get by, one action at a time." I believed it for the first time in weeks. Weeks passed. I found a peaceful routine, helping Grandma with her winter roses, drinking chamomile tea while relaxing on the couch, and allowing the antique radio to mend me. It wasn't simple. My concerns gnawed at me in the dark and my tummy grew. Grandma, however, kept me in check. She would say, "Kid, we'll manage. We always do." And Grandma didn't freak out when the time came when my water broke on a hot August morning when I was doing the dishes. Her old station wagon squealed into the hospital parking lot as she snatched up the car keys and dragged me to Springfield Mercy. She smiled and remarked, "It's time to meet this little one." Work was terrible. Hours of agony gripping Grandma's hand and muttering curses as she dabbed at my perspiration. She whispered, "You're doing fine, honey. Just continue to breathe." Then he was here, with one last shove that tore a cry from my throat. A small boy, sleek and squalling, with dark, fluffy hair all over his head. The fear subsided for the first time in 9 months when the nurse placed him on my chest. I gazed at his hunched face and his little fists. He was flawless. As I held him closer, my arms shook, as though releasing him would ruin his miracle. His small chest rose and fell in perfect rhythm, his skin warm against mine. "My son." I brushed a quivering finger across his cheek and whispered, "You are my joy, my secret." Grandma leaned forward, a rare, broad smile spreading across her lined face. "Observe that," she muttered. As fierce as his mother, I grinned for the first time since my parents closed the door in my face and Ryan left. Perhaps I wasn't as isolated as I believed. Everything slows down for a while, immediately following the birth of a child. It doesn't matter how hurt you are, how worn out you are, or how much of a mess you are, all of it is suddenly irrelevant. The small, frail human being cuddled up against your chest is all that matters. His scrunched up face, wrinkled little fingers, and his steady yet gentle breathing all caught my attention as I stared at him. I suddenly realized that he was mine, my son. He lacked Ryan's easy smile and hazel eyes. He lacked my father's stern jaw and my mother's keen nose. He simply was himself. Excellent. I ought to have been afraid. I was too. I was God. However, beneath the terror lay something greater, something more powerful, a battle. I had no idea how I was going to accomplish this. However, I was going to, since he merited it, since he was worthy of me. He was given the name Samuel by us, but he was always Sammy to me. 2 days later, Grandma drove us home from the hospital, both hands grasping the wheel as if she were transporting the Queen of England rather than a teenage girl with a broken neck and her newborn. With Sammy curled up in my arms, I sat in the passenger seat and watched the town pass by in a whirl. My former existence high school, football games, and hushed vows in Ryan's car's back seat seemed like a fantasy. Now this was genuine, and that was scary. The initial weeks were chaotic. Sammy screamed all day and all night. I didn't get much sleep. I had no idea that certain parts of my body might hurt. And money was a nightmare of a completely different sort. I had nothing. No work. No savings. I had already spent the $50 I had stuffed in my pocket the night I left home on formula and diapers. Grandma, who was on Social Security, tried to help. She started skipping meals, saying to me she just wasn't hungry, and I noticed that her fridge was half empty most of the time. I wasn't a moron. That meant something to me. So I did the only thing I could do one afternoon. Sammy was left with Grandma while I went into town to look for work, so I wrapped him up and gave him a forehead kiss. A 17-year-old girl with no graduation, no experience, and a baby at home was not someone anyone wanted to hire. I entered every restaurant, retail establishment, and petrol station. We're not hiring, sorry. Try to return next month. Someone with more experience is needed. Just as I was about to give up, I noticed a small diner on the outskirts of town, Rosie's. The windows were foggy from the heat inside. The paint was peeling, and the sign was ancient. The bell over the door jingled as I pushed it open. Behind the counter, a woman raised her head. Wiry and sharp-eyed, she was in her 60s and had a cigarette hanging from her lips. As she wiped her hands on her apron, she declared, "We're out of pie." I took a swallow. "I'm not here to get pie." She arched an eyebrow. "So what?" I clenched my fists and made myself stand up straighter, saying, "I need a job. I'll stop at nothing. Mop floors, clean dishes, and bus tables. I work hard and pick things up quickly." She exhaled a cloud of smoke and looked me up and down. "Have you previously waited tables?" "No, however, She gave a snort. I didn't believe so. My stomach dropped. One more rejection. To my surprise, she then snatched a notepad from beneath the counter and threw it at me. She said, "Coffee is needed at table 4. Black for the guy, cream and sugar for the woman." I blinked. "Wait, you're actually hiring me?" She grinned. "You have 5 minutes to show that you are not worthless." I'm not sure what happened to me, but I nodded and picked up the notepad. "Yes, ma'am." I followed the instructions correctly. I didn't reveal any information. The woman, Rosie, leaned against the counter and nodded at the conclusion of my trial shift. She remarked, "You're rough around the edges. However, you have fire. Tomorrow is when you begin." I almost started crying. Rather, I took a deep breath and said, "Thank you." She gave a nod. "Thank you, not yet. The customers are terrible, the tips are dreadful, and the pay is minimum. However, it's work. And what I needed most was work." Rosie's Diner became my second home for the ensuing years. I put in as many shifts as I could. I learned how to avoid snatchy trucks, how to balance 6 plates at once, and how to maintain a positive attitude even when my feet felt like they were about to fall off. It wasn't glitzy. It wasn't simple. However, the lights remained on. It kept Sammy nourished. Grandma didn't have to miss meals because of it. That was the only thing that mattered. Sammy grew up in that diner's rear booth. During my breaks as a baby, I would rock him to sleep in Rosie's office. As he grew bigger, he would sit at the bar and swing his small legs while I worked, writing in journals. He was intelligent. So incredibly intelligent. He started asking questions that I was unable to respond to by the time he was 5 years old. What causes clouds to float? What causes magnets to adhere? When birds migrate south, Why do they know where to go? I tried my hardest to stay up. I would check out books from the library, watch documentaries with him at night, and attempt to answer all of his questions rather than dismissing them, the way my parents did. Additionally, I will always remember the day that Miss S. Larson, his first grade teacher, drew me aside during parent teacher conferences. With her glasses sparkling in the fluorescent lights of Springfield Elementary, she informed me he has a gift, enjoys resolving issues. Because of the way he explains things, half of the class comprehends. I glanced over at Sammy, who was using a crayon and a package of sugar to help another 6-year-old understand the idea of gravity. Something warm, something I hadn't felt in years, swelled in my chest. Pride. Genuine, intense, and painful pride. This was what I had done. This is what I had fought for. Out of nothing, I had constructed something, and I wasn't going to give up, no matter what the world threw at us next. When my life altered once more, Sammy was 10 years old. By that point, a rhythm had been established, stable yet not flawless or easy. When I could, I worked double shifts at Rosie's 6 days a week. Sammy's afternoons were either spent at the library or experimenting with vintage electronics that Grandma had discovered at yard sales. Life was easy. Tiny. After that, he entered. It was late in the afternoon on a Thursday. The pause between lunch and supper rush had left the diner half empty. The bell above the door jingled as I was cleaning the counter after pulling a double. Just another customer, another refill, another order to take, and I hardly looked up. However, my stomach did this strange twisting thing when I looked up. Rosie's place was not the right spot for the man standing there. Tall, perhaps in the late 30s or early 40s, slicked back brown hair with gray at the temples, sharp suit. The type of guy who preferred fine dining establishments in the heart of the city to a dilapidated diner that reeked of grease and burnt coffee. With waves of assurance, he entered the room as if he owned it. I picked up my notepad and straightened. "Sit down anywhere," I yelled. He selected a rear booth. I approached and took out my pen. "What am I able to get you?" He looked at me for a moment as if he was assessing me. Then he grinned. "Coffee. Black." Exasperated, I wrote it down. There was something about him that annoyed me. "Is there anything else?" He put his elbows on the table and leaned forward, saying, "That depends. Is it you who spilled coffee on me?" I went cold. What? Then it made sense. Oh, Sheen. I spilled a whole pot of coffee on a wealthy man wearing a suit months ago after tripping during a shift. Despite my fears that he would yell at me or sue me, he simply chuckled, took a hideous corduroy jacket from me, and walked away without a word. I had forgotten all about it. However, it seems that he hadn't. I tightened my hold on my notepad and swallowed. "Was that you?" he muttered. "Lance Carter," as if the name had some significance. He extended his hand. "I choose to disregard it." I apologized already. He grinned more broadly. "I understand. I simply enjoy watching you wriggle." I frowned. "Would you like your coffee?" He laughed. "Indeed. And perhaps a discussion." I scowled. "Why?" He gave a shrug. "I'm interested in you?" Does he find me interesting? How could that possibly imply anything? People like me go unnoticed by those like him, and they never had a good rationale for it when they did. I ought to have ignored him. Walked off. He acted as though he didn't exist. However, there was something about him that annoyed me, like his cool confidence and his willingness to push. I was also too exhausted to say anything. "Observe," I yelled. "I don't have time for games, but I'm not sure what you want. I have expenses to pay and a child to raise. Therefore, this chat is done unless you are placing an order for food." Lance cocked his head in contemplation. Then he made a statement that almost caused me to drop my notepad. "All right. Let me meet him then." I blinked. "What?" he said. "Your kid," with all seriousness. "Allow me to meet him," I sneered. How could I possibly accomplish that? Leaning back, he grinned once more. "Because I want to know more about the woman who doesn't hesitate to reprimand me." I gazed at him. This guy was who, the devil? I didn't immediately say yes. However, he returned the next week. But then again, always ordering black coffee while seated in the same booth. He would occasionally bring me small gifts, like a pack of chamomile tea for Grandma or a book on physics for Sammy. It meant nothing, I told myself. But I ended up calling his number one evening after closing. I murmured. Okay, as he picked up. My son is yours to meet. Once. A pause occurred. Then a soft laugh. See you on Saturday. That Saturday afternoon, Lance arrived. This time, no suit. Just a brown paper bag, jeans, and a flannel shirt. He handed me the apples and remarked, I thought they would go well with dinner. I simply gazed at him. Are you attempting to win over my grandmother? Is it functioning? Despite rolling my eyes, I let him in. Grandma was in the kitchen peeling potatoes when her piercing gaze instantly shifted to Lance. You must be the wealthy one, she remarked without admiration. Lance smiled. That depends on whom you ask. She nodded toward the living room while snorting. All well then, he's inside. I felt sick to my stomach when he entered. I was unsure of Sammy's reaction. He had never known a father figure. Hell, our former mailman, Mr. Duffy, was the closest thing he had to a male role model. Sammy looked up from his notebook, his large hazel eyes inquisitive, and I held my breath. Who is this? He inquired. Lance lowered himself to eye level. He looked at the stack of books beside Sammy and said, My name is Lance. What do you have in progress? After a moment of hesitation, Sammy displayed a sloppy circuit board sketch, trying to understand the motion of electricity. Impressed, Lance whistled. That's difficult stuff, Sammy smiled. Not at all. All that is involved are electrons traveling along a path, similar to water flowing through pipes. With real interest, Lance nodded. Do you enjoy science? Sammy's face brightened. Suddenly, they were conversing about gravity, space, and circuits. Lance didn't simplify anything, didn't dismiss Sammy's inquiries. He simply listened intently. And I wasn't sure how to react to that. When Lance eventually departed after supper, Grandma glanced at me over the sink. As she rinsed a plate, she remarked, He's good with the boy. I let out a sigh. I understand. She looked at me while wiping her hands on a towel. What is the issue then? I paused. I simply don't believe it. Grandma hummed. You know, not all men are Ryan. I took a deep breath. I understand. She arched an eyebrow. Do you? I didn't respond because, really? I wasn't certain. Lance, however, continued to appear, once every 7 days. Then twice. Then one evening he invited me to supper, not at a fine dining establishment, not where he could show off his wealth, at Rosie's, my territory. And I made a careless move for the first time in years. Yes, I replied. It meant nothing, I told myself, that I was merely interested, that it was only one meal, but I knew better in my heart. Because when I saw him the way he listened, the way he spoke to Sammy, for the first time in a very long time, I felt anything, I hope. And that, the scariest thing of all, was that. Peace never lasts, and I should have known that. For months, everything was going well. They were better than before. Lance continued to appear, not only at Rosie's but also at our house, at science fairs at Sammy's school, and at late-night meals with Grandma. He had evolved into something more than a wealthy man wearing a fine suit and grinning. Someone stable. I also detested how much I enjoyed it. I reassured myself that I wasn't becoming attached. However, he put down his fork and said, I want to meet your grandma and your son after we had completed our burgers at Rosie's one cool October evening formally. Mid-sip of my coffee, I froze. You're already familiar with them, I stated gently. Lance gave a headshake, not in that manner. I mean, I would like to participate in this. A portion of you, my stomach turned over. Lance, he remarked, I know you don't trust easily. However, I'm not leaving. Furthermore, I don't want to be the guy who only turns up for a few months before vanishing. Freya, I want more. Setting my cup aside, I gazed at the steam rising into the atmosphere. More. It had been a very long time since I had allowed myself to consider more. What's the scariest, though? I also desired it. Lance knelt on one knee on Grandma's front porch 6 months later, on a sunny spring afternoon. His voice was firm as he continued, Marry me, I was having trouble breathing. Inside, Sammy was working on a science project. With her arms folded and a chuckle on her face, Grandma was observing from the doorway. Lance displayed a tiny box. No big speech, no enormous diamond. Only he treated me as though I were valuable. I ought to have said yes right away. However, Years of being rejected and told I wasn't good enough caused me to second guess myself. I swallowed and said in a whisper, "Give it some thought." Lance simply grinned as if he had anticipated that response. "Take as much time as you require." He meant it too. However, everything fell apart before I could decide, before I allowed myself to believe in happiness. First, there was a phone call. My phone buzzed with an unfamiliar caller as I was in the kitchen chopping veggies. I nearly didn't respond. However, I felt compelled to pick up. "Hey?" Quiet. Then Freya. My entire body froze. I hadn't heard that voice in 15 years. "My dad." "Dad?" I muttered. I heard him shakily exhale. "It's me, my love." No, he didn't have the right to call me that, no. Not after his actions. My knuckles were white as I held onto the counter. "What are you looking for?" Another long silence. "Then I want to see you, softer, shattered." I laughed resentfully. "In the dead of winter, you threw me out. You want to see me now?" His voice was thick as he said, "I was wrong. I have missed you, Freya. I've missed everything. It's too late. It's too late to express regret, apologize, or do anything else." I began to end the call. I felt sick to my stomach when he stated it. "I am aware of Sammy, my veins filled with ice." "What?" "I am aware of him," my father muttered. I'd like to get to know my grandson." The globe seemed to have swung to one side. How was he aware? Was he observing us? Was this a nasty joke? Then it dawned on me. The hospital man. The person who kept looking at Sammy. The one who insisted on referring to him as a miracle. Oh, my own God. I tightened my hold on the phone. "You were the one, weren't you? In the medical facility?" Quiet. My ears throbbed with my heartbeat. I muttered, "You've been following us. Have you not?" He took a trembling breath. I knew after seeing him. "Freya, he's family. I wish to make this right." My entire body trembled as I slammed my hand into the counter. "This cannot be fixed by you." 15 years. He wanted to be grandfather of the year after 15 years? "No," I growled. "Now you can't just walk in and act like you care. Please, Freya." I ended the call, and I was really scared for the first time in years. I kept it from Lance, not immediately. I ought to have. But I wanted breathing room and time to think. I hardly ate or slept for days. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my dad waiting to take Sammy away from me in my doorway. It was foolish, illogical. However, fear disregards reason. It is simply aware of survival. After a week, he arrived. A truck rolled up the driveway when I was outside hanging laundry. And there he was. My dad, appearing older, even more exhausted, more human than I thought I had recalled. I didn't care, though. I threw down the basket and rushed in his direction. "Why in the world are you here?" His eyes were wild as he raised his hands. "I simply know," I yelled. "You can't simply do anything. That right is no longer yours?" He bobbed his throat. "I know I'm not worthy of forgiveness, Freya, but you don't." He was halted by that. His eyes were full of tears, but I suppressed my emotions. Not rage, not melancholy, nothing. Then he looked away from me, to the entrance. My heart stopped, considering that Sammy was present, observing. Sammy was unable to comprehend. Not quite yet. However, I could see the questions growing in his head. I could see he was interested. With my body acting as a barrier between us, I turned back to face my father. "Go," I said in a flat voice. "And don't return." He let a tear fall down his cheek. "Freya, I told you to go." He slumped his shoulders. He took a deep swallow. Finally, he gave a nod. He climbed into his pickup and drove off without saying another word. I stood there with a racing heart and unsteady breath. Then a tiny hand slipped inside mine. "Sammy." "Mom?" he muttered. "Who was that?" I gave his hand a squeeze. "Nobody," I said, "and perhaps that will be the case in the future." I watched the stars that night while sitting on the porch. Lance came to sit next to me in silence. I hadn't given him all the details. Not quite yet. I eventually grabbed for his hand, though. I muttered, "I think I'm ready." His brow furrowed as he turned. "For what purpose?" I looked him in the eye. "For additional information." Lance grinned. And I allowed myself to believe in a future for the first time in my life. One without reference to the past? I had one to retain.